what we'll see are the tools of behavior geneticists and all the criticisms and why this winds up being a very contentious field. Okay, so this being another version of getting at how do you know when a behavior has a genetic component. And we're immediately allowing ourselves to be a little more subtle here, not determined by genes, not determined purely by nature, all of that merely to have a genetic component, a genetic influence. How do you begin to do that? And this is a world where people, the scientists, don't sit around coming up with evolutionary models. They don't sit around trying to find mutations in genes. They have a very different sort of strategy. They look for patterns of shared traits among individuals who have differing degrees of shared genes and infer relatedness and infer genetic influences from that. Okay. What's the simplest, most mindless version of doing this? The basic initial rules centuries ago when behavior genetics started was the notion if you see a trait that is universal in a species, obviously it's genetic, obviously it's hardwired, obviously it's instinctual, obviously that's an extremely limited approach. Yes, indeed, you will see some species like flies in which certain behavioral traits are determined by relatively small numbers of genes and are universal. This is obviously going to fall apart when you get to something more interesting than a fly. So what's much more sort of the starting point for the whole field is to say, ooh, look, here's some behavioral traits that run in families. Genes run in families, therefore we may have just found evidence for a genetic influence on these traits. And of course it takes about 1/8 of a second to come up with the retort to that, which is yes, genes run in families, but environment runs in families as well. So the standard response is to now put a little bit more strictures on it to say, okay, it's not just the genes run in families, but as we know from a few weeks ago, the more closely related you are, the more genes you share in common. Our Mendelian rule of half the genes with full sibling, etc., following thus the logic that if you have a behavioral trait that becomes more common, the more closely related two individuals are. Now you're inferring something about genetics. And of course, the problem there is not only as you become more closely related to somebody, do you share a greater percentage of your genes, you share environment more. Obviously, you are sharing environment on the average, in most cases, much more with a sibling than with a first cousin, than with an eighth cousin. The trouble is shared genes and shared environment tend to covary in families. So that greatly weakens what was the initial classic approach to the field 70, 80 years ago. Okay, so you got to come up with something fancier, something more informative, something more subtle. And what you wind up doing then is let's control for environment. Yes, obviously the eighth cousin is living in a different world than your full sibling. Let's control for environment under circumstances where you examine relatives where they have the same environment and they differ in terms of the amount of genes they share. And what is this classic approach? Look at identical twins versus fraternal twins. Monozygotic twins from one zygote, monozygotic identical twins versus dizygotic. And the general notion there is, okay, identical twins share 100% of their genes. Fraternal twins share 50% of their genes. So if identical twins are raised in the exact same environment, and fraternal twins are raised in the exact same environment, they all have environment shared. What's the only difference then to explain any behavioral differences? If you see a trait that is shared to a greater extent in a pair of identical twins than in fraternal twins, what's the only difference? They all grow up with identical environments. It's because the identical twins have twice the amount of genes in common, 100%. You could thus infer a genetic influence on that trait. Because it's the identical environment, twins get raised absolutely the same, and the only difference is the degree of relatedness, the degree of shared genes between monozygotic and dizygotic twins. That one should take about 2/8 of a second to demolish for the simple starting point that, oh yeah, sometimes fraternal twins, dizygotic twins, are different sexes. Okay, so that complicates things. So you come back and you're a little bit more rigorous now, and you restrict your comparisons of monozygotic to dizygotic to same-sex dizygotic pairs. And then you institute this rule, okay, same-sex twins, whether identical or fraternal, are raised essentially in the same environment. So if you see a greater sharing of traits among the monozygotic twins than the dizygotic, the only place that greater sharing could be attributed to is the fact that they have more genes in common. We have just identified a behavior that has a strong genetic component. So the big problem with that approach is, anyone, who's a twin in here? Whoa, that's a lot of hands. Identical twins? Dizygotic twins? Any triplets? Okay, just to extend that, armadillos always give birth to 4 identical offspring at once. Okay, so that having been prompted, what we then move on to is the obvious problem with this entire approach. Hooray, monozygotic twins get raised in virtually the same environment. Dizygotic twins of the same gender get raised in virtually the same environment. That's not true in the slightest. There is far more differentiation of environment for dizygotic twins than for monozygotic twins. They are treated differently as pairs. Thus, if behavioral traits are more in common between monozygotic twins than between dizygotic, it could be because these guys share more genes in common and or because they share more environment. A completely flawed approach in that regard. The next complication, it turns out monozygotic twins don't always have the exact same environment. Well, yes, obviously one of them gets sneezed on at a higher rate by a kid sister or something, and that's going to produce just decades worth of consequences. But even in other domains, monozygotic twins don't get treated exactly the same in some circumstances. And here is what it looks like if I had drawn it. Okay, so you got your twins, and this is during fetal life, and there are fetuses in there. And okay, there's one, and with a little thing of hair, and there's the other. Okay, and what you have is a placenta forms. And here's the deal with monozygotic twins: if they split during the first 5 days after conception, they wind up each one with their own placenta. On the other hand, if the split occurs between days 5 and 10, there's already commitment to one placenta, which they then share. So monochorionic pregnancy or bichorionic. And what does that wind up meaning? In the monochorionic, the two fetuses share bloodstream to a greater extent than in the bichorionic circumstance. In these cases, it's separate blood flow for mom. Okay, it's still the same mom and it's still ultimately the same blood, but it's going to be subtle differences in levels of stuff in the bloodstream. With a monochorionic, the environment for these fetuses are much more similar in terms of whatever is carried in the bloodstream. Okay, great. That's a great factoid, and that's like interesting things about identical twins, but like different levels of nutrients, whether it's coming off of a blood vessel here versus there. Okay, maybe that makes a difference, but these are going to be minuscule differences, nothing interesting. As one example of it, monochorionic identical twins have more similar IQs than do bichorionic identical twins. Just one demonstration that this could make a difference. This is relevant. The IQs are more similar. And this has been one reason why marmoset monkeys, pair bonding, so you know what they're all about. Among other things, marmoset monkey mothers always give birth to twins because there's two parents around to take care of them, and it's got a completely screwy circulatory system for the twins that are unlike either of these, and thus all sorts of people have been interested in marmosets over the years, the ones who couldn't afford to buy themselves armadillos, interested in terms of looking at the differences in blood flow during fetal life there of twins. Okay, so we start off here that just because you see something more in common in monozygotic twins than dizygotic, that doesn't tell you the first thing about whether it's genes involved. They share environment much more. Then even trying to make sense of what's going on in monozygotic twins, what you've got there are fundamental potential differences in environment starting at a very important early state of life. So monochorionic versus bichorionic.